All right, thank you, and good morning, everybody. So Sergio and I want to keep this very informal, so just interrupt us as you wish. We thought we would, let me show you. I mean, first of all, we don't have any disclosures. You know, we're federal employees. We can't have disclosures. So this is the outline of what we are going to do. We're going to define combining immunodeficiency because you are probably familiar with SCID. And there's always some kind of confusion, what is CID as opposed to SCID. So we'll define them, we will review what the diagnostic criteria that European Society for Immune Deficiency has recently developed for CID. Dr. Rosenzweig will cover all of the laboratory evaluation and genetics and give you a lot of background about inheritance and what laboratory tests are useful in both diagnosing and monitoring these patients. I will review critical features, treatment options, expectations, and most important point. Feel free to ask any questions. We hope we have answers, but we'll see. Okay, so you're all familiar with severe combined immunodeficiency, and this is a typical cartoon of severe combined immunodeficiency. This is David Becker, who you probably know, and you know he was also known as a bubble boy. And his mother is here at the conference. So SCID is actually the most severe form of primary immunodeficiency. Newborns are usually after birth. You heard about newborn screening and how important it is to diagnose in a pre-symptomatic stage this condition, because that offers the best perspective for definitive cure. The main feature of SCID is actually absent, and this is actually a key difference with CID, absent or very low number of T cells. Now, B cells and NK cells may or may not be present, but because of the lack of T cells, the B cells that require T cells to help them make antibodies are dysfunctional. So you also have antibody deficiency in SCID. It's very heterogeneous from a genetic standpoint. CID is even more heterogeneous than SCID, and we'll review that. And because of the lack of T cells, very low number or absent, these infants are prone to severe infections already very, very early in life. So first months of life, another big difference with most cases of CID. And they're susceptible to a broad spectrum of pathogens. And we'll review which pathogens are more common in CID. They often present with chronic diarrhea of age to thrive. If you immunize these infants with live viral vaccines, the first one that is given in life is rotavirus. These may lead to serious complications. Potentially also fatal, especially if you use the measles, mumps, rubella. And in any case, if you do not treat severe combined immunodeficiency, most of the times with bone marrow transplantation, unfortunately, this is a fatal within the first years of life. But now we know, I mean, actually, transplant is a definitive cure, and results are getting better and better. You may have probably heard about the most recent results. Now, the Primary Immunodeficiency Treatment Consortium, which is the largest network of centers in North America, caring for patients with SCID, Risk-Disorder syndrome, CGD, and now also the immune dysregulation disorders, has defined criteria for severe combined immunodeficiency and has distinguished between typical forms of SCID and atypical forms of SCID, and also Omenn syndrome. And so I'm simplified actually this criteria in this slide, but I think these are the key points. So again, if you look at the number of the T cells, patients with SCID have a very low number of T cells. Keep in mind, newborn typically around 2,500 T cells in peripheral blood. So this is very low. You will also notice that I wrote autologous because some patients with SCID may have maternal T cells in the circulation, and the number may apparently be higher. These are maternal T cells, which is something that doesn't happen in good numbers in healthy babies. So that's another biomarker of severe combined immunodeficiency. So T cells are extremely low in number. They do not work. What this is actually, Sergio will review this, is the capacity of the T cells to expand, proliferate, in response to appropriate stimulation. PHA is a mitogen. So these patients have T cells that proliferate less than 10% of the lower limit of normal, whatever that means. And like I said, I mean, the presence of maternal T cells, even if the number is higher, would be an indication of SCID. Any mutation in a SCID-causing gene associated with a striking phenotype would also be suggestive of SCID. But we'll see how that may be confusing when it comes to CID. Atypical SCID are, if you wish, a little less severe in that the number of T cells, as you can see, is higher, but still significantly lower than the normal number. And more importantly, the T cells, we can use markers, surface markers on T cells to distinguish those that are just introduced by the thymus versus those that were introduced a long time ago and expanded in the periphery. And so you want to have in a healthy baby lots of these naive T cells, which are just introduced by the thymus. If you find few of them, that's another indication of something going wrong. The T cells in these infants, not only they're present in higher number than in typical SCID, but also they have some residual capacity to proliferate, still lower than normal. This is between 10 and 50% of the lower limit of normal. And in this case, you find this term, which you may not be familiar with, hypomorphic. What hypomorphic means is that mutations are in the same genes that cause SCID, but in this case, they allow some protein expression, some protein function, and this is why you have a less severe phenotype. Keep this in mind, because many forms of CID are actually also due to hypomorphic mutations in SCID-causing disease, but are even less severe than what you find in atypical SCID. Omenn syndrome is a very unique phenotype. These are babies that present with generalized red skin. They have often big lymph nodes, big spleen, big liver. They have diarrhea. And they do have T cells, and in some cases actually T cells are even higher than normal, and these are their own T cells, but they are oligoclonal. It means they're not diverse. They are very restricted in their capacity to recognize pathogens, and because of that, these patients are also prone to infections. Not only they have this red skin, erythroderma, this is what it means, but they also have increased number of eosinophils, I mentioned, liver and spleen enlargement, and they have elevated IgE, and again, may have some function in their T cells. Now, there were no criteria for combined immunodeficiency until 2017, when the European Society for Immunodeficiency prepared this criteria. Now, you have to consider that diagnostic criteria are never written in stone, and they evolve. And just think that actually we didn't have criteria for typical and atypical SCID until more or less 8-9 years ago. There were no criteria for SCID before PIDD worked them out. So these criteria, one can argue with some of them, but I would say for the most part, actually they're good criteria. But you will see they are profoundly different than the other ones. The other ones were really based on the number and the function of the T cells. Here we're looking actually at clinical manifestations. So if you look at the clinical manifestations, the ESID defines CID as a condition where you have at least one of these. So at least one severe infection, and severe infection here is meant to be an infection that requires hospitalization. At least one manifestation of immune dysregulation. And this is very important because immune dysregulation is a key component of the combined immunodeficiency. What do we mean by immune dysregulation? We mean autoimmunity, and we'll see what type of autoimmunity in particular, inflammatory bowel disease, which needs to be diagnosed properly using colonoscopy, not just diarrhea. That's not enough to define an IBD. Severe eczema, lymphoproliferation, which again means big spleen, big liver, big spleen, big liver, big lymph nodes, granulomas, or affected family members, which tells you that, again, we're talking about genetic disorders that may run in family. Not only one of these, at least one of these, but also 2 out of 4 of the following. And here we are, again, with T cells. And so, low number of CD3, which is total T cells, or CD4 or CD8. So you see this is much more relaxed than the criteria that we use for SCID, typical and atypical. It doesn't say variable, it says reduced. It doesn't say less than 300, up to 500. It's actually reduced. So even 2,000 in a baby would be reduced. And it doesn't say necessarily total T cells. You may have a deficiency only in one of these subsets, and that's already good enough. Reduced naive. So these are the T cells that are just introduced by the thymus, and there are markers to define them, CD4 and or CD8. Most of the T cells express a receptor on the cell surface that recognizes antigens, pathogens, whatever. And there are really two types of receptors. One is called T cell receptor alpha beta. Those are two chains, an alpha and beta chain that compose this receptor. That actually is present in the vast majority of T cells, approximately 85-90% of T cells in the periphery. They express this kind of receptor. But there is an alternative receptor, which is called gamma delta, that only happens in normal individuals in about 10-15% of T cells. But in these patients with CID, this can be significantly expanded, and we'll also review when it is expanded. And then you see again reduced proliferation to mitogens, again PHA, or other ways to stimulate T cells like activating their T cell receptor. You need to exclude HIV infection, because HIV infection would also result in many of these features. That would not be CID. And you need to exclude clinical diagnosis associated with defined forms of CID, but they're not just CID, they're much broader than this. So let's review this. Ataxia telangiectasia, which is a neurological disease, unfortunately still untreatable, uncurable, although there is some attempt to improve the quality of life of these patients. Some of these patients are born actually already with low T cells, and in fact there have been babies identified even by newborn screening with ataxia telangiectasia, but it is a much broader condition where you have significant neurological problems. Is keratosis congenita, or DKC. These are patients that not just lymphopenia, they often have a hypoplastic bone marrow that may result actually in anemia, thrombocytopenia. They have other abnormalities. They often have problems in their oral cavity. They have problems in like leukoplakia, so they have often problems in their nails. Cartilage hypoplasia is a form of growth defect, growth low stature, associated also with a variable degree of immunodeficiency, occasionally very severe, even SCID in some cases, but most of the times CID, and these patients also are prone to bone marrow failure, inflammatory bowel disease, Hirschsprung disease, and others. So you want to exclude these diagnoses because that would be defined, they would have their own prognosis, and you're left with anything else, which is a very broad range of conditions. So again, we want to basically compare SCID versus CID. Again, this is presenting very early in life with a very profound T cell deficiency, virtually no capacity of the T cells to respond, lack of adaptive immune responses that makes these babies highly prone to infections early in life. The CID, by contrast, may present really at any age, often in childhood, most of the times in childhood, but there are cases that have been recognized even in adulthood. And now that we have genetic tools, and Dr. Sergio will actually show you this, we're identifying more and more of these conditions even in adults. They do have a T cell deficiency, but you see there is no more the profound. Immune dysregulation is frequent here. You don't really find immune dysregulation very much here. And in fact, I mean, later on, we also will talk about immune dysregulation in SCID, but the right title would be immune dysregulation in CID, because you don't see much immune dysregulation in SCID. And variable capacity of mounting adaptive responses. But that said, we're not talking about necessarily two genetically distinct conditions. They are phenotypically distinct, clinically distinct, but they may be due also to different mutations in the same gene. And this is important because if there is someone that has been diagnosed with a defect in a gene, and the clinical presentation doesn't match what you find by Googling, you look for that gene and you find that actually everything you read is about severe combined immunodeficiency. You say, well, but that can't be. I mean, it's not my case. Well, this is the reason that actually different mutations in the same gene may cause very different clinical phenotypes. All right, so what do we know about this condition? This is the number of all combined immunodeficiencies. That includes SCID, because SCID is which part of the combined immunodeficiency, the most severe form. From 1983, when actually the first classification of primary immunodeficiency was developed, to 2017, I mean, actually this year was when the last classification was released, and you see here a growing number of combined immunodeficiencies that we now recognize. For the most part, actually, this increase is a reflection of an increasing number of genes that have been identified that, when abnormal, may cause combined immunodeficiency. But again, we also know that different mutations of the same gene may cause different diseases, and so this number is basically the sum of the new genes plus new phenotypes. If you look at how these evolve for all primary immunodeficiencies, again, same classification, but now you don't have only CID, you also have all other forms of immunodeficiencies. Take, for instance, the most, the ones that everybody knows about, which is the antibody deficiency. Well, these are the antibody deficiency. CID has actually increased in terms of number of defects. It's now much larger as a group than the antibody deficiency. The only one that really is higher than CID is the immunodeficiency syndromes. Now we recognize many of them, but these are often very, very rare. Few individuals identified for each disease. And the other one that is becoming more and more important is the innate immune defects. But other than that, you see the CID really pops up as one of the most prominent groups of immunodeficiency. Not in terms of number of patients, but in terms of number of diseases that we identify and we recognize. All right, and so that actually brings me to introduce Sergio, because this is just the list of genes that have been associated with combined immunodeficiency in the latest classification. Now, if you ask the question, well, how many patients with each of these? Well, for some of them, there are actually a significant number of patients. You will see here CD40 ligand, X-linked hyper IgM syndrome. That's a form of combined immunodeficiency. That's not that rare. But others are extremely rare. If you look at, for instance, ROH, CK deficiency, transferrin receptor deficiency, you can count the number of patients who have been identified with these diseases on in some cases even on one hand. So very, very few. So that, of course, brings the problem: how do we diagnose these diseases? How do we know what the clinical evolution of these diseases is? How do we treat them? Since we know only a few patients worldwide that have these problems.
Genetics. Thank you, Gigi. So, in the next 3 hours, I'm going to try to explain. Okay, I'm going to try to make it short. The next 25 minutes. Don't worry, Chris. No, that's just 25 minutes.
Just do it in Spanish.
Oh. Don't challenge me, because I'll do it. So, as Gigi said, so what we're trying to explain is kind of the armamentarium that we have. I will not go for each of those diseases. I will tell you the platform that we use to diagnose all of them together. So then you might identify yourself with some of the tests that I am going to explain, but I will not go to each of them. And as we speak, there's another, and another, and another new disease being added by the minute. So no, this is an incomplete list, and I will try just to explain the general rule that we use to diagnose them all together. So, having said that, so this is going to be kind of the idea that we're going to follow. We're going to study, whenever we face a patient that we want to study their immune system, we look for the presence of cells and enumeration, we look for the function, the protein that's present or enumeration, the protein function, and then genetic testing. It doesn't need to be in that order. So those are the steps that you have to follow, and this applies to SCID, applies to combined immunodeficiency, and to whatever you have. But keep in mind that you have to fulfill those approaches whenever you are being diagnosed with a primary immunodeficiency. I guess that most of you are patients, or some of your loved ones that have diseases. This is what your doctors have done whenever they face you or your relatives. So let's go to cell enumeration. So Gigi was talking about SCID and combined immunodeficiency. We use flow cytometry. So that instrument allows us to identify cells by their shape and their granularity. So, but also we use antibodies to identify particular markers that help us to define cells. So here we use CD3 that defines T cells. So here you have a healthy control, here you have a patient, here we're using CD3 and CD19. CD19 is a marker of B cells. Every B cell has CD19. Every T cell has CD3. So whatever cells you have here that they express, they're positive for CD3, B cells are positive for B cells, those are negative for both. But then we use another markers. Cells that they are negative for T cell markers or B cells markers, they're NK cells that we identify with this another marker. So this is an individual healthy control that has T cells, B cells, and NK cells. Then we have a patient that has yes B cells, no NK cells, no T cells. So that patient has a real problem. Has no T cells, has no NK cells, but has B cells. This is one of the most common forms of severe combined immunodeficiency and is defined as a T minus B plus NK cell skip patient, in this case because it was a gamma C. What I'm trying to show you is the platform, the scaffold that we use to diagnose you guys, your relatives. So here you have some other stuff that Gigi was referring to you, the alpha, beta, gamma, delta. So we use markers here, alpha, beta, and here CD4. So here whatever is positive for both, express both of those markers. So the lymphocytes in this healthy control individual, they express CD4 and they express alpha beta. And we have nothing here, they're going to be CD4 negative and alpha beta negative. But this individual here has those same cells, but has plenty of those cells that they're alpha beta, but they do not express CD4. This guy has also lymphoproliferation and autoimmunity. This patient has ALPS. So it could be as simple as that. I'm oversimplifying, but what I'm telling you is those are the tools that we use to identify cells and enumerate them. Keep in mind that whenever your doctor orders lymphocyte phenotyping, they also have to order a CBC and diff because you need to count the cells. This instrument always allows us to discriminate them based on percentage, but we need to know how many cells you have in order to know the exact numbers, because having 100% of nothing is always nothing. So you want to know how many lymphocytes you have in order to make sense to our results. So here you have another type of patient. So here we're using CD3 that identify T cells, and we're using CD20 that's close enough to CD19 and also present in B cells. So here you have a healthy control that has T cells, B cells, and cells that they are neither T nor B. Those are likely to be NK cells. But look at this patient. Has here T cells, has some of the cells that they are negative, but doesn't have any cells that they express CD20. Those patients lack B cells, and as you can imagine, B cells as the factory of immunoglobulins, those patients are going to be a gamma globulinic. In this case, this patient was an X-linked gamma globulinic. So what I'm showing you is tools that we use to identify and enumerate cells. But there are some different areas that we want to explore. So the T cells, they make different things. So they help us to control cellular immunity, and those T cells are called Th1. They help us with the humoral immunity, with the immunoglobulins and antibodies, and they're called Th2. They help us to control inflammation and immunity, and they're called Th17. And they help us to regulate the immune system, kind of the police that controls everything. They're called Tregs. And we have markers for all of them, so we can identify them. So for example, cells that they are Th1, they produce a lot of interferon gamma. Cells that they are Th2, they produce a lot of IL-4. Cells that they are Th17, go again, they produce Th17. And the ones that they are Tregs, so they have specific markers, they produce TGF-beta and IL-10, but they have other markers that help us to identify. So here you have, by using interferon gamma and IL-4, we're able to discriminate the Th1 populations and the Th2 population. So that's going to tell us, not that you have to have a problem with cellular immunity or humoral immunity, but that's going to tell us you have cells that they can provide support to provide a good function enough to support those functions. So here you can see this patient doesn't have enough Th1, cellular immunity kind of T cells, or Th2. And the same thing happens with Th17. This patient has low Th17. Those patients are usually associated with CMC, chronic mucocutaneous candidiasis. So IL-17 pathway has been strongly associated with the control of candida and other fungi. So this is how we identify. I don't want to point to anybody, but somebody said, yeah. So yes, because some of you are patients, and this is why we are looking at you guys. So here, for those of you that you have some other disease that they are associated with low Tregs, here you can see how we identify Tregs. Those are critical for particular diseases as IPEX and some other diseases. So here you have a control that has this population that expresses CD25, a marker of the IL-2 receptor, and FOXP3. This control has it, this patient doesn't have it. So it's very clear that this patient is in a disadvantage because it lacks the cell that help to control autoimmunity. So then, cell function. So as Gigi said, we want to make the cells work, because just the presence of the cell doesn't mean that they are working. So every time that we identify something, we want to know that it's working. So one of the main things when Gigi was talking about severe combined immune deficiency and was talking about combined, he said lymphocyte proliferation, PHA, mitogens. So there are different methods that we use. This is very practical because it's not very reactive. I guess that you have seen Chernobyl in HBO lately. I don't want any reactivity in my lab, so we are moving to these kind of tests because they don't use reactivity and they use dyes. So we load our lymphocytes with a dye and then we stimulate them. And we said, guys, divide. So whenever they have 100 molecules inside, the time that they divide the first time, now we have two cells that they have 50 and 50 dyes. And then they divide again and they have 25 and 25. So we dilute the dye, and this is when you start, and each of these peaks needs a cycle of division. So we can check how the cells divide by diluting the dye that we have put inside of cells. And the beauty of these tests that we use flow cytometry is that also help us to identify CD4 cells and CD8 cells. So that the other methods that use reactivity, they just use that above. So every method has pros and cons, but this one first will not get into the Chernobyl situation because there's no reactivity, and also help us to discriminate different cells, how they proliferate or not. Other functional tests, so I don't know if any of you or your relatives, they have NK function deficiency. It's not that I'm in the wrong room. Lisa Ford is going to be talking about NK cells, but you can also check how other cells work. So NK cells, as their name states, they're natural killers. They go, they kiss a cell, and they kill them. They release things that they are inside. And there are markers that they're just inside the cell. They're always going to show up whenever they kiss and they open up. So this is the CD107A test, and this is what we check here. So here you have a healthy control that we use their NK cells to see when we stimulate it, they express this marker that's called CD107 that's hidden inside. But they'll go and try to kill somebody, they open up and they show CD107. This guy was over to showing it up, this patient was unable. So what we know is this individual has a problem with their NK cells because they cannot do what they're meant to do. They cannot open up and release whatever they have inside. Then protein presence and enumeration. So we want to know how much protein do you have. And that comes back to different diseases. This is not one of the diseases that we're going to talk because Gigi said, despite visco average, it's a combined immune deficiency because you have T cells and B cells affected. It's a well-defined phenotype that will not follow under the CID classification per se. But here, just to show you how we determine, here you have a control individual. This is kind of our control of the experiment. Here's the amount of protein that this patient has. Here you have a viscoelastic equation, and clearly has no protein because it didn't shift from here to here. So it's very clear that we couldn't find the protein. But there are some others that they have milder phenotypes that they just shift a little bit. So it's not just a matter of black and white. This is going to be black or white, you decide, and this is going to be the opposite. The protein is present, the protein is absent. But here you have the grayscale. How much protein do you have? It adds another layer of complexity. Having the protein is not enough. Sometimes you need more in order to make it work. And they're going to come up with some of the genetic diseases that they call haploinsufficiency. Half is not enough sometimes. And then you have another disease that probably some of you have, or you know people, Doppler deficiency. Here you have our control in the experiment. Here in T cells, we show that the red line or the red peak is the protein is expressed in monocytes, and here you have a patient does not express the protein. So here is very clear that this patient doesn't express this protein, that will make it very likely that this patient has this particular disease. In this case, Doppler. But now, let me add another layer of complexity. Here we have a healthy control for gamma C, the most common gene associated with severe combined immune deficiency. Here you have the experiment control, here you have the expression of gamma C, and it's very clear. Then you have this patient that has a gamma C mutation and doesn't express the protein. Question for you. What do you think about this guy? He's labeled patient. What do you think? There's something confusing there. You think that I'm making a mistake? Very unlikely. Or there's a possibility that this is a patient that has something wrong.
It looks wrong.
It looks wrong because I say patient. That's right. But what happens? Just the presence of the protein doesn't certify that the protein is working. And this is the other thing that I want to introduce here. So this control has the protein and be likely be working. This guy that doesn't have the protein, it's unlikely to be working because the protein is not there, but the presence of the protein is not guaranteed that the protein is working. And here we come back to what Gigi said, hypomorphs or missense mutation. You can detect the scaffold, but you cannot detect in here the function. So this guy has a mutation in gamma C that doesn't preclude the expression of the protein, but prevents the function. And now we are going to test. So that the protein is present, that's what we need to study all those layers of studies whenever you're evaluating a patient. It's not just the cell is there. You have to show me that the cell is working. It's not that the protein is there. You have to show me that it works, because that's going to discriminate the different layers of complexity of PID diagnosis. So protein function, now that leads to the previous one. So here are different examples. So there are patients that they have different signaling problems. So what we do in the lab is the cells produce the scaffold here. We provide the cytokine and we look at the readout. For example, there is a pathway, many pathways that is involving multiple cytokine signaling. So we want to know if everything is working fine. So we want to know gamma C. Gamma C is the most common form of severe combined immunodeficiency and some other ones. So we'll provide IL-2 and we'll look for STAT5 phosphorylation. If we provide IL-2 and we detect STAT5 phosphorylation, it means that the patient has the receptors, has the JAK stats, and have the molecules that they need to be phosphorylated. So we provide the triggering and the readout. The patient has to provide the machinery in the middle. So here, I will show you an example of a different disease, STAT1 gain of function. And that goes back to what Gigi was saying. Here you have the normal control individual. Here you have the control of the experiment and how much is shift, not that much. But you can see that there's a blue line that is kind of shifted to the right. Look what happens to the patient. He's working even more, but more is not always right. So if you compare here the control of the experiment, the patient here and the control, you can see that the guy does more than what is expected to do. Because this patient has a mutation in STAT1 that makes gain of function. And again, more function is not always good. So that's why it's important to detect that the cells are there, the proteins are there, and they're working. They're not underworking or they're not overworking. Because patients with certain forms of combined immunodeficiency, their problem is that they are overworking rather than underworking. So here, another pathway that we also can explore, PI3 kinase, P110 delta, P85. So the whole mTOR pathway, we know how to do it. It could be done. It's not just a matter of finding a mutation, it's just to show that the mutation is affecting a function, or a protein expression, or a function. And here you can see that the patient here in blue is working more than the red. So here you have another example of gain of function. Again, you have to detect cells, you have to detect proteins, and you want them to show you how they work. They can work just fine, they can work less, or they can work more, and nothing is better than being the center. They have to work just the exact amount that you want them to work, because you might have problems in any other direction. So then, genetic analysis. So, genes can be complex, and now we're using a lot of genetic testing in order to go backwards and do the test that I have just described for you. But keep in mind that whenever we do any genetic testing, we'll be looking at your DNA, you will be looking at the transcript or the RNA, and then at the end the protein that we already discussed about the proteins. But we'll be focusing here on what is the approach that we usually take in order to do genetic testing. So, few reminders, just to be everybody on board and on the same page. Whenever we are doing genetic testing, it's because we want to look for mutations. Mutations are permanent changes of the DNA, and they come in multiple flavors. You can have a whole gross deletion, you can have small insertions of deletion, big chunks of DNA. But the most common one is single nucleotide missense mutation. Just one letter. One letter in the whole alphabet of the DNA is changed, just one. And this is the most common one, and the one that we don't know what it does. That's when also functional testing becomes very important. So how does that one letter impact on whatever we are reading at the DNA? So let's try to make it with a phrase, or in a case of however in a sentence format. So because every nucleotide usually goes in pairs of 3 in order to transcribe to an amino acid. So I just pick words that they have 3 letters each. So for example, 1, 2, big soup. So when you have a missense mutation, it means that you change one for another. So instead of reading 1, 2 big zoo, 1, 2 big zoo. It's not a big zoo anymore, now it's a bit of a zoo, because you change one letter. But if you have a nonsense, it means that you stop reading, you lost that big on the zoo because you said 1, 2, nothing else, because you found a stop color, and the protein is not complete. You can have a frame shift. If you insert letters or you delete one, in anything that's not a multiple of 3, it means that you change the frame of how you're reading. So instead of have 1, 2 big zoo, 1 zoo, big or big zoo. Whatever, I think that Chris can read it better in English. So Chris, you think that you can read this one better than I? I shall to my Spanish? Yeah. So what I mean is, this is all the things that we face whenever we do genetic testing. And then, it's going to be the matter of inheritance. Not all diseases are inheritance in the same way. So there are some that are very common, and we all remember. We don't need to be doctors in order to remember that. So the autosomal recessive, you have half wrong information from that, half wrong information from that, from mom, that we don't decide how you're going to go to our children, and then you have 50% chances of having heterozygous individuals that are going to be just like mom and dad, 25% chances that they're going to inherit the 2 mutated alleles, so they're going to carry the disease, and 25% chances they're going to be completely healthy. So this is one of the most common ones, the ones that we understand better. Then we have autosomal dominant. Many of the diseases that we're dealing now, or the new diseases, they are autosomal dominant. We have the affected father, the unaffected mother, and the chances are 50% that they will have affected children. And they could be either males or females, because these are in autosomes that are not the sexual chromosomes. Then we have a little bit more known and more complex X-linked recessive, like severe combined immunodeficiency or Wiskott-Aldrich. You have a mom that is a carrier and is usually asymptomatic, and the chances are that they're going to be 25% chance of having a male that is affected, 25% chance of having a female that's going to be a carrier just like her, asymptomatic by a carrier, and 50% chance that they will have no problem with their children. And then you have X-linked dominant. So here you have the affected mother and affected father. This is different than this one. This is going to be like Nemo. So Nemo is an X-linked dominant disease. Moms, they carry the mutation and they do have symptoms, but they're usually different than the ones that their children have. So here the chances are, remember here the mom was unaffected, in this one the mom is affected, and here the chances are because she's affected, and if she passes the disease, in 50% of their offspring, they will all be affected, and it could be a male or a female, because mom just always give us an X chromosome. Then we have more complex mitochondrial or codominant, this kind of the blood type. You can be A or B or 0, and there are different forms, but keep in mind that whenever we do genetic testing, we look at those things. And there's another thing. So whenever we test your blood, we're checking the whole body, but not always all the mutations are found in our blood. Sometimes it happens that our mutations are hidden in our sexual organs. And there's very good examples of that. I know that it doesn't make too much sense, but let me tell you a couple of stories. This guy here, he is a truck driver from Brazil. Lovely guy, super lovely guy. So lovely that he had 1 wife, 2 wives, 3 wives. Oh, he had super lovely wife. And he was so lovely that he wanted to have kids with all his wives. And actually he happened to have 1 affected children with a mutation in P110 delta, another one with another woman that has the same mutation, and another one with another woman that has the same mutation. So he said, okay, the only common thing there is the dad, so let's go draw blood and test his blood. And he was negative for his mutation. So somebody said, okay, so what he's seeding is not in his blood, it's somewhere there. So somebody was already collected the sample coming from there, and they analyzed it. And they found that the guy carried the mutation just there, but not here. So if you don't find a mutation in your blood, it doesn't completely exclude that you don't carry mutations. Makes sense? It's complex and it happens. So you have to keep that in mind, because if somebody says, we need to retest, because there's something that they call germline mosaicism, it's something that it happens. It's not super common, but it happens. So then, matter about our diseases. Not everybody carrying a mutation will have the disease. And this is what we call penetrance. Penetrance is a black and white thing. You have the gene, if you have full penetrance, you have the disease. But then, you know that you have relatives of yourself. You might have somebody in your family that carry the same mutation that you, and you're or more sick or more healthy than your relative. And this is the expressivity. Both of you guys that carry the gene have the disease, and the disease is penetrant. But not everybody in the same family will have the same manifestations, because we have many other genes that help us to regulate how they work. So this is when people talk about penetrance and expressivity. And then here's an example of that, but I will not, it's exactly the same thing that we're saying, but now we have to which tests are we using. And you heard, and probably many of you have been tested by next generation sequencing. And that means that people have been using whole genome sequence, they have been using whole exome sequence, or targeted. There's nothing particular about them that makes them one better than the other one. They are more sensitive, they're more specific, but the test that we need is the one that's better fitted for your disease. So it's not that if somebody does a panel is wrong. So sometimes it's what we have access, and sometimes that could be enough. So those are the tools that we have to use them wisely. And here's the information. So there's a lot of information in the genome, it's 3 times 10 to the 9, and that's going to be represented by whole apple. And the exome is just 1%. So it means that if you don't find a mutation in the whole exome, doesn't mean that you don't have a genetic disease. So when you analyze 1% of the information, you didn't find anything. So it doesn't exclude that you have a genetic disease. And this is a good example, just to finalize, on how those tools are used. And what this paper told us, this is a paper from Baylor, this paper told us that depending on the genetic disease that you have, what's going to be the success rate when we do genetic testing randomly, unbiased. Let me show you here the example of severe combined immune deficiency. If you have a very severe phenotype, when you use whole exome, it's very likely they're going to find a diagnosis. But you have an immune dysregulation disease, it's very unlikely that you're going to find it. So don't feel too disappointed in the first round of studies they didn't find a diagnosis, because this is the default. So in general, our success rate in general is 40%. So it means that 60% of the time we fail with our genetic diagnosis. So don't feel disappointed. It's not that we are that stupid. We're semi-stupid, but not completely stupid. Those are the limitations of the studies. So this is what it is. If you have a SCID, we'll likely find it. If you have an autoimmune disease, it's unlikely they're going to find it in the first round. But we'll keep on working. If you have combined immune deficiency, it's kind of between 40 and 50% based on the phenotype. So, but just to conclude, and going back to Gigi, that he will have to say more smart things than what I have said. So keep in mind that whatever the diagnosis is for your disease, you cannot use just one tool. It's not just physical examination. It's not just cell enumeration. It's not just protein function. It's not just genetic testing. You have to combine them all. Because if we think that with one single tool will make all our life easier, we are wrong. We have to combine them, and sometimes we have to repeat them. And we beg you for patience, because we will not succeed the first time. Be patient with us, because we're doing our best. Thank you.
Would you like to ask questions to Sergio now? Yes. That's a good idea. Yeah, go ahead.
So,
yes.
Finding
No.
an immunologist who's willing to look at CID as a diagnosis as opposed to just saying it's CVID has been difficult. My son and I both have CVID. My daughter has innate cell deficiency, but we definitely meet the criteria, the European criteria that was listed there. And we have a dozen.
Please go ahead.
Dozen specialists.
So CVID.
We have had sequencing, whole exome. We know we don't have any of the ones listed here.
As far as you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
there might still be errors, not in the exons, but somewhere else in those very same genes. So we cannot give for granted that there is no error.
I did screen real quick while you guys were talking, and we don't have one listed in the current.
I know, but then what was done was mostly it was all exome sequencing.
Yes.
So when we do all exome, we cannot make 100% sure that there are no errors, even in the same genes. There might be errors in regulatory areas of those genes, and the exome doesn't cover.
Okay.
So keep in mind that the exome is just 1% of the genetic information, and we're looking just the parts that we know is the low-hanging fruit. In this case, the low-hanging apple. So we're looking for just the very basic thing, the most easy to find.
We do
But
have one
let me give you an example.
associated with CVID, PLCG2.
Yeah.
Yep.
We know that.
Yeah.
But that's kind of, and we know we have autoimmune, autoinflammatory, inflammatory bowel disease.
So I think you need to keep the door open. Well, keep pushing, and there are other ways. I mean, eventually all genome will become more and more available, and that will probably help us. Just to give you an example, when you have a car and you need to go somewhere, you need a starter, right? So when you do exome sequencing, you're not looking at the starter. You're looking at anything else in the car. The starter, which is called promoter, for a gene is not captured by your exome. So if you have an error in the starter, the car doesn't move. You do have an error, but the whole exome didn't find it. So all genome might find it. Now, understanding what is the consequence of an error in the starter is much more difficult than understanding what is the consequence of an error in an exome, which is translated into part of the protein. That is the problem. But I think all genome may eventually lead to many more responses than we know. And definitely CVID is a diagnosis we don't like anymore. And I know you don't like it. We're discovering.
17-year-old disabled in bed.
Yeah, right, absolutely.
Yeah.
So but it's a moving target. So keep the door open. We will learn more and more about.
Keep pushing the deeper doctors who are willing to
Yes.
Yes.
push that
Or
envelope in.
research institutions. So sometimes you have to move from practitioners.
We're everywhere. And then treatment. How does treatment change? Because we're currently on 2 grams per kilo for the autoimmune and neurological.
Well, we're going to talk.
We're going to talk about that. We had another question. Yeah. Yes.
I have 100 questions, but I managed to write down 3. So can CID become SCIDs, or once SCIDs has been ruled out, we're happy with our CID, and thanking God it's not.
Again, we're going to cover this, but let me say, usually it's the opposite. You can have a SCID baby that, for instance, receives a transplant. The transplant is partly corrected. Or you have initial good success and then you have waning of immunity because you haven't really engrafted enough of stem cells. So you lose your donor stem cells. As you lose your donor stem cells, you still maintain some of the donor T cells, but their numbers is decreasing over time. You turn from a SCID into a CID kind of condition.
Did you say lose donor?
Yes, you may lose your donor because to make T cells you need a stem cell.
Right.
So if you haven't engrafted a stem cell, sooner or later, most of the times, your T cell number will decrease because you're not providing stem cells to the thymus to make new T cells. That exhausts over time. So many of these patients are actually experiencing years and years after the transplant some waning of T cell immunity. So you may turn from a SCID into a CID at some point in your life. So you have SCID, you're transplanted, you're well for 10, 15 years, and then 15 years down the road, 20 years down the road, you start developing again some symptoms.
But it can't go the other way.
Well, so there are some conditions, I'm going to talk about this. There are called profound combined immunodeficiency, where initially you may not have all of the features of SCID, but eventually you are found to worsen over time. And so then you're recognized with a SCID-associated gene. You may have.
Can I change your question just a bit?
Sure.
So perhaps what I understood is any of those diseases progressive that they can go from one to another one?
Right.
So we speak Spanish. So next time to Gigi in Italian. So most of these diseases are stable, most of them. They are one way and they're going to stay most of the time the same way. If you had a transplant, you have many other variables added. But most of these diseases, they are in one way and they don't progress. But this is not a rule that applies to all of them. There are some that they can go worse, not that many that they can go better. But in general, if you are a severe combined immunodeficiency, you will likely be a severe combined immunodeficiency. You are a combined immunodeficiency, you will be like that. We know that there are some diseases that they are progressive. But in general, you are CID, you wouldn't be CID. We know that with CVID, that doesn't apply. In the same family, people start like IgA deficiency and they move to CVID. That was one that we know that is progressive. These guys are more steady.
Okay.
Nothing good about being steady and being combined immunodeficiency. But in general, so you are like that and you will be like that. You will add damage to your lung. So then it's not because your immune system gets worse. It's because when you have one pneumonia, then you have a scar in your lung. Then you have two, you have scars in two parts of your lung. So that makes you more predisposed to more infection. But your immune system will probably stay in general.
Okay, very good. Can a sibling test negative, a healthy sibling, or apparently healthy, test negative for CID or all of this, because he has 5 diagnoses. His brother tested for a possible stem cell transplant donor, and he tested negative, which meant he's not a carrier. So we're thrilled about that.
The germline things, so if he
But
already has
could
it,
he become later? That was the end of my question, I'm sorry. But could he, so if he tested negative, years down the road, he won't present?
no. And it doesn't apply either to the germline mutations, because you said that you're negative here, but you can be positive there. So that doesn't look to be the case, because what he has probably it's just on him or whoever, and it was brought from the mom. So it's very unlikely that 2 siblings, one going to be the whole body and one just on the sexual.
Great news. Great news.
So can we give some other person a chance, and then we come back after the meeting?
Of course.
What's the relationship between inborn errors of metabolism and antibody deficiency?
Okay, so let me again reinterpret your question too. Inborn error of metabolism is John Loran Casanova, new name for primary immunodeficiencies. So in general, we're talking about PIDs or inborn errors of metabolism. Within PIDs or inborn errors of metabolism, you have different things: innate immunity, antibody deficiency, severe combined immune deficiency. But if you want to analog and say what they mean, PID is the same thing that inborn error of metabolism. So they are the same thing, and they have sub-classifications. So, but this is it. So you can call them PIDs, primary immunodeficiencies, or immune errors of metabolism, or not metabolism, of immunity. You say metabolism?
I said metabolism.
So, sorry, I completely went to the side of the one. So metabolism usually metabulopathies. So they're patients that they have different things. They have errors in the urea cycle, glycogen cycle. There's different things. They might have an impact on the immune system, but they are different stories. So they are a different set of diseases. There's some overlap. Some glycogen disorders, they have primary immunodeficiency, but that's the main issue. So we call PID or inborn error of immunity one thing. Inborn error of metabolism is just the metabolism of sugars, proteins, lipids, blah, 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 blah. They might have an impact on the immune system, but this is a different story. Sorry, I completely took the question towards the wrong direction.
Because you speak Spanish.
Because I think you should get it in
Just one question about diagnosis. After that first slide, how often does somebody present with maybe IBD and they're diagnosed first with IBD, put on immunosuppressants, and then down the road they're getting pneumonia, so all this. So when maybe should they be tested for underlying or how? What would you kind of?
Yeah. So immune dysregulation actually may often be a presenting sign. In general, immune dysregulation, not just IBD. Actually, there are other types of immune dysregulation that are more common than IBD in combined immune deficiencies. You may have those before having a serious infection. That's why the classification I mentioned from the ESID that actually at least one serious infection. I'm not sure actually. Some patients, but those patients eventually in the course of their life, most of them will experience a serious infection requiring hospitalization. But the presenting sign may be autoimmunity. It could be IBD. Most of the times it's actually autoimmune cytopenias, autoimmune hemolytic anemia, thrombocytopenia, less often neutropenia. That actually happens quite a lot. We'll review this, so it's possible. So yes, if you have those symptoms, I think it's appropriate at this point, even for just pure IBD. More and more often people are doing now genetic studies, even if you just have IBD, even more so if you have IBD plus infections. Absolutely, you should be investigated.
And if you have a very early onset IBD, that definitely, exactly, that has to be studied. So you don't care what else. You have IBD in the first year of life, you have to study. So that's kind of all the timing of the presentation.
Pediatric GIs need to be here.
They are here. There's a lot of people. Oh yeah, with very early onset, I would say that most of them they are. Yeah. Now the real guy.
All right. What you have a pointer? What do you want? Okay, great. Okay. So I think we went through this. Okay, here's the question that you asked about SCID and CID, can you go one way or another? So this is a study actually from Germany. And what they looked was 51 patients with what they call profound combined immunodeficiency. So they had combined immunodeficiency, what was relatively profound, both in terms of clinical severity as well as in terms of immunological severity. And then they looked at, in this group of 51 patients, what type of gene defects did they actually find. And so there were a proportion of these that did have mutations in genes that are associated typically with SCID. So they call them atypical SCID. You see where the classifications now become a little, they merge together. I mean, I told you what the PIDD defines as atypical SCID. I told you what ESID defines as CID, and here you have CID patients that are now being re-diagnosed as having atypical SCID. And you see here, the majority of them actually have RAG gene defects. RAG deficiency very often presents as atypical SCID or combined immunodeficiency, less often as typical SCID. It may happen, but it's less common than atypical. And then there were patients that were also found to carry gene defects, but these are not gene defects that you find in SCID. These are truly CID gene defects. What you see here, there are many unknown. So even if you do genetic studies, again using Olexome, these were all studied by Olexome, there is still a good chunk of patients that we don't know what the gene defect is. If there is a gene defect, we cannot formally make sure that these are genetic diseases, but it's likely that they are, and we're simply unable to identify with current tools what the problem is. If you look at age at the diagnosis, and now you divide the atypical SCID, the real CID, and the unknown, so CID with unknown gene defect, you will see that there is not much of a difference in terms of the age at the onset, the diagnosis of primary immunodeficiency, nor a difference in the age of inclusion in this study, which means that even if you have different gene defects, they may present very much in a similar manner. So again, this adds to complexity because you are initially diagnosed one way, then you're diagnosed in another way, one way or another, or you remain without a genetic diagnosis. From a clinical standpoint, they may be exactly the same thing. Clinically, they may present exactly the same way. The other question was CVID and CID. And so this was another study that was published also from Europe, actually from, in this case, from, it's a multi-center study, a study from Vienna. 176 patients with CVID. The majority of them were adults, but there were also children who were given the diagnosis of CVID. And then genetics became available, was made available to all of them, and you see now changes. So look at here, these are the CID. So there was a fraction of the adults that actually were initially diagnosed as CVID, and then when genetics became available, they were found to carry a mutation in a CID gene. There were some children also who were initially given a diagnosis of CVID, and now they've been re-diagnosed as having CID. 10 out of a total of 23 out of a total of 176. So that means 13% in this study, 13% of the CVID patients eventually were re-diagnosed as having CID, either with a clinical diagnosis or with a genetic diagnosis. Some patients actually were defined in another way. For instance, there were patients that were actually found to carry mutations in genes associated with A-gamma-globulinemia. They were not initially diagnosed as A-gamma-globulinemic because they had some immunoglobulins. So they were not A-gamma, but they did carry mutations in genes associated with A-gamma-globulinemia. So CVID, I think of CVID right now as still a basket where we put lots of patients we don't quite understand. We have criteria to define those, but this may change over time. So do expect changes if you've been diagnosed with CVID. Now, will it have implications in terms of treatment? Yes, it will. And in terms of what to expect, it's a whole different story if you're found to have a defect associated with CID versus a defect associated with a gamma-globulinemia. The type of infections you may have, the type of problems you may experience are very different. So it is important to come to a final diagnosis. Right, the other thing, so when I started actually many years ago, the general idea was that And a healthy individual, you have what is called immunological competence. So you are capable of mounting immune response against pathogens that helps you keep you healthy. And you're also able to protect yourself against malignancies, at least up to a point in life, and autoimmunity. And so the idea was that if you have too little of immune system, then you would have immunodeficiency. Immunodeficiency might also manifest as malignancy because you're not able to kill your cancer cells. And if you have a too active immune system, then you would end up having autoimmunity. So if you look at this kind of a seesaw model of immunological competence, immunodeficiency and autoimmunity, or as we prefer to say now, immune dysregulation, are really at the opposite ends. And you could not have together in the same individual infections and autoimmunity at the same time.
Don't we wish?
Yeah.
Yes,
But that's totally wrong, right? Yes, that's totally wrong. So CID are actually the prototype of conditions where you have, in fact, at the same time, infections and immune dysregulation. So what type of infections do you often see in CID where the T cells are there but they are dysfunctional? They have very often recurrent or chronic viral infections, and some viruses more than others. They have often warts. They have often EBV, Epstein-Barr virus, and often the virus reactivates. So you can find chronic EBV viremia, what they may tell you. They may develop shingles, or they may develop multiple bouts of varicella. They can develop molluscum. Unfortunately, they are also at risk because they are EBV positive, many of them. They are unable to control the EBV. The EBV may reactivate, but may also lead to lymphomas. So EBV-related associated lymphoma are more common in this group of patients with CID than in healthy individuals. So these are all infections or malignancies, to some extent related infections. They also have immune dysregulation. Immune dysregulation may come in many different flavors. Granulomas, vasculitis, skin nodules, autoimmune cytopenias. You mentioned IBD. There are many other ways of manifesting an immune dysregulation. Again, contrasting now the type of infections you have in patients with SCID, Omenn syndrome, atypical SCID, and the CID. So in patients with SCID, you all know that pneumocystis is something we want to avoid. We have tools to treat the pneumocystis, but it's a very common infection. It's an opportunistic infection, lung infection, that may lead to severe respiratory distress. They often have oral thrush or diver rash. They may have some viral infections. If you immunize them with rotavirus, they would develop diarrhea, but they often develop diarrhea also because of norovirus. They have these other infections, parainfluenza, adenovirus. Some of these are very bad viral infections with SCID, and they have cytomegalovirus. If you immunize, and in some countries this is still done, in many countries, to protect against tuberculosis by giving the BCG vaccine. The BCG is a live vaccine, and these individuals may lead actually to serious complications. They also are prone to bacterial infections, but I would say that these kind of viral and fungal infections are way more common in the SCID babies than the bacterial infections. Omenn syndrome, they have a red skin, they have lost their barrier. So now you have bacterial infections, including systemic infections that are way more common, but they also have the same kind of infections as SCID babies. Atypical SCID, now you see the cytomegalovirus becomes very, very important. We all, in general, catch a cytomegalovirus at some point in life. The vast majority of healthy individuals are cytomegalovirus positive. But in these patients with atypical SCID, when they catch a CMV, quite often they will develop also autoimmune hemolytic anemia. It's something that is seen very often after a CMV infection. Also bacterial infection, and here are the CID, and again the same pathogens that I mentioned. Varicella, EBV, papillomavirus leading to warts, norovirus, contracted watery diarrhea, which we often see in adults. And you also see the same thing in patients with SCID that receive transplant, didn't get good stem cell engraftment, and over time they lose their T cells, they end up having exactly the same kind of problems as this ones. Okay, so how common is the immune dysregulation. So those are infections. Now let's see the immune dysregulation. This is a study that was published only a couple of years ago by Alain Fischer in Paris. It's a large series of patients, and he was looking at the probability of developing some kind of immune dysregulation in various forms of immunodeficiencies, and he distinguished between antibody deficiencies, B non-CVID or B-CVID, so these are basically antibody deficiencies, innate defects, and combined immunodeficiency. And so although the general assumption has been that autoimmunity is common in common variable immunodeficiency, it's actually very common, and a majority of the patients with immune dysregulation immunodeficiency do have common variable immunodeficiency. In fact, if you focus on the patients with combined immunodeficiency, they have an even higher chance of developing some manifestation of immune dysregulation. And they often develop these manifestations in the first 20 years of life, quite often actually from that age. So this is different than what you see in CVID, where the immune dysregulation is common, but often happens later in life. In CID patients, it happens more often earlier in life. What immune dysregulations? So especially autoimmune cytopenias, and in particular autoimmune hemolytic anemia, autoimmune thrombocytopenia. This can be very severe, can be a very serious problem. But you may also develop organ-specific autoimmunity. So what type? Hypothyroidism, with autoantibodies against the thyroid. Vitiligo, alopecia, you mentioned IBD, congenital enteropathy, vasculitis. Many of you may have heard about these, especially in patients with CVID. This is something that is often diagnosed in the lungs. They talk about GLIL. GLIL stands for granulomatous lymphocytic interstitial lung disease. It's not an infection. It's actually presence of more lymphocytes than you want in the lungs. It's a manifestation of dysreactivity of the immune system. Granulomas that may happen on the skin, but really in any organ. I've seen patients with granulomas on the tongue, in the liver, anywhere, in the kidney, anywhere, the bone marrow, and lymphoproliferation, especially manifesting as splenomegaly or lymphadenopathy. You can have one of these, too many of these. It varies from patient to patient, but immune dysregulation is very common in CIDs. Malignancies. I mentioned that patients with CID unfortunately are more prone to some kind of tumors, especially lymphomas, and especially EBV-related lymphoma, but not just EBV-related lymphoma. This is actually a study from the USID-NET registry. So if you're a member of the USID-NET, if you gave your name or your relative's name to the USID-NET registry, you contributed to this study. And so the question was, how many cases of malignancies do we see in the registry? And in particular, how common are malignancies in the group of patients that are diagnosed with a CID? And the answer was not that common, fortunately, but you do see it, 5%. This is higher than in the general population by the age. So there is an increased risk, but really malignancies were only seen in a minority of the CID patients. What type of malignancies? Again, I want to emphasize especially lymphomas. And in the majority of the cases, you do find this infection by the Epstein-Barr virus. But you can have lymphomas without the Epstein-Barr virus, or you can have a patient, and we did a case like this, that actually do carry the Epstein-Barr virus, but the lymphoma is not due to the Epstein-Barr virus. So things may happen. Keep in mind that lymphoproliferative disease may also manifest with diffuse lymphadenopathy and splenomegaly, but that doesn't mean that there is a tumor. So eventually you need a biopsy and appropriate tests, molecular tests even, to define whether this is truly a tumor versus a lymphoproliferation, a benign, so-called benign lymphoproliferation. Sometimes this may look like a pneumonia, because you can have a tumor in your mediastinum, and so that, from a symptom standpoint or even a radiological standpoint may mimic a pneumonia, but it's not a pneumonia. So anything that persists there requires aggressive investigation. I mentioned already that you need to distinguish a real lymphoma from a lymphoproliferative, a benign polyclonal lymphoproliferative disease. However, in all of these cases, medical attention and proper testing is urgently needed. It can be treated. If you treat it, it usually requires chemotherapy, and in some cases also some kinds of serotherapy like rituximab, but eventually represents that if you have a CID and you develop these problems, the most logical thing at that point would be to follow the chemotherapy with appropriate transplantation if possible. These are not the only tumors. There are patients that I mentioned had warts. So there are some forms of papillomavirus that are associated with an increased risk of squamous cell carcinoma. And we've seen several cases of CID developing squamous cell carcinoma. For patients with CD40 ligand deficiency, they have an increased risk of intestinal tumors, and in particular of biliary tract tumors, or also this kind of tumor which is called PNET, peripheral neuroectodermal tumor. Leukemias are not that common in the group of patients with CID, but in some of them, especially in those associated with DNA repair defects, you can find leukemias. Again, tumors are fortunately not that common, but it is clearly higher risk than in the general population. So again, another study, same group from Germany, looking at, okay, now you have the profound combined immunodeficiency. What is the overall frequency of severe events per year, and what type of events are they? And so if you look at this, the total number of severe events, meaning requiring hospitalization and aggressive diagnosis and treatment, was not that high, 1.37 per year. What were they? Well, you see here, immune dysregulation actually accounts for about 50% of them. Cytopenias, other immune dysregulation. Some were infections, and some were due to chronic lung disease because you accumulate damage to your lungs, and then eventually that requires hospitalization at some point. So you have both infections and immune dysregulation as a reason for being hospitalized. So how do we diagnose that CID? Well, you often start with a clinical phenotype because these patients have not been diagnosed at birth with a newborn screening. They have failed the newborn screening. Otherwise, if they're diagnosed at birth, they end up being either in the typical or the atypical SCID category. So diagnosed later in life, and most of the times they're diagnosed because of a clinical phenotype. As Sergio mentioned to you, you need to look at appropriate tests of immune function, looking at the phenotype, the number of the cells, the type of the cells that they have, the presence or absence of the protein. You need functional testing to look at how that protein is working. You need to look at in vivo how they're actually capable or not capable of responding to vaccines. That's humoral phenotype. But you also do genotyping. And so you do either targeted or whole exome sequencing. And quite often now, we go from here to here. Or we go to here and here at the same time. Because the advantage of doing immediately a genotyping is that you may actually have a response pretty soon. And this response can be more informative than doing just these tests, which can give you some clues what the defect might be, but still eventually you need this one to come to a definitive diagnosis. How do you manage? Well, as I mentioned before, when I showed the list of genes, unfortunately for many of these CID, only a handful of patients have been reported, and so that makes it very difficult for us to help you and tell you what exactly can we expect, what are the best options in terms of treatment. So the optimal management strategy may be very hard to define. It may be hard for us. I can understand it may be even harder for you to be left without a clear and obvious answer. But some general guidelines can be given, and so there are some preventive measures. There are some ways of doing proper diagnosis and monitoring, and obviously something about treatment. One important point is that in the vast majority of cases, these are truly disorders that eventually stem from the stem cells. They're genetic disorders. So in theory, you could use a transplant to cure them. But the results of transplant are very different in different disorders. So you cannot merge them together. You have to look specifically at what has been done in that specific disease and what exactly is the outcome. Okay, so immunoglobulin replacement therapy. If you have a combined immunodeficiency, most of the times your immune system is, in any case, incapable of mounting good antibody responses. So immunoglobulin replacement therapy is a mainstay of therapy. It won't help with the T cell function, but it will provide you in a passive manner the antibodies that your immune system is incapable producing. We often use Bactrim for pneumocystis prophylaxis, although, as I mentioned, pneumocystis is less common in this group of diseases than in typical SCID. Antibiotic prophylaxis in general may be helpful, and in some cases we use also azithromycin. The azithromycin is both an antibiotic, but has also anti-inflammatory properties, and I mentioned there is a lot of inflammation often in these patients, especially from the lungs. Azithromycin can be good. If you have actually a history of varicella, or if you have a history of severe herpes virus infection, we put these patients on protection using antiviral medications against the herpes simplex or the varicella zoster. You need to suppress those viruses, especially the varicella zoster remains with you forever in the body and might cause shingles and might cause severe episodes, so you want to suppress it. Fungal prophylaxis, if you have a profound immunodeficiency, you're also prone to fungal infections, so many of these patients require antifungals. But none of them necessarily applies in every single patient. So you have to look on a case-by-case basis, what exactly is your problem, how profound is the immunodeficiency, what is your clinical history, and you come with all those spectrum of those treatments. Monitoring. Respiratory status has to be monitored and has to be monitored regularly and rather aggressively. We like to do PFTs, pulmonary function tests, on a regular basis, at least once a year, in some cases even every 6 months. This is a non-invasive analysis of the lung function. It's very important for these patients because chronic lung damage is a major cause of death. We often do CT scanning, unless you have radiation sensitivity. Some forms are associated with errors in DNA repair. We perform CT of the chest on a regular basis also. Some people will do it every 2 years, some people will do even every year. Again, you cannot generalize. You have to look on a case-by-case basis. We want to look at the organ function, and all the key organs have to be monitored: the liver, the gut, the kidney, endocrine glands. So we do basically, yes?
Well, I have a question about the previous slide.
Yes.
Thank you, sorry. I would forget it. So the prophylaxis, we have a bag of drugs from our immunologists. If you have this, take this. If you get this symptom, take this symptom. So should we be taking these things on a regular basis? Or he just treats it as the viral infection occurs, or...
Right, so for viruses, typically, we don't put individuals on viral prophylaxis.
Okay.
For a number of reasons. First of all, because we have very few antiviral drugs which are really effective. That's the key point. We put on antiviral prophylaxis patients who actually have mostly a history of serious problems with either HSV or VZV. For EBV, none of these really would work. For CMV, we prefer to monitor and treat as the virus reactivates. But for these two, if you have a history of serious varicella, yes, we want to suppress the varicella virus. So there are drugs there. Otherwise, we don't put on chronic antivirals. There is also some toxicity associated with some of these antivirals, so we don't want to expose you to organ damage with unnecessary use of antivirals if there is no reason to use the antivirals.
Okay, we have a bag of drugs for all of that, but I just want to make sure we were taking it the right way.
Yeah, so again, a pneumocystis prophylaxis is typically given chronically. That's Bactrim. And Bactrim has also antibacterial properties, especially good against Staphylococcus, by the way. Immunoglobulin replacement therapy, I mentioned most of these patients would be on IVIG or sub-use. This is something that we do, again, if there is a history of recurrent Candida infection, or if the T-cell immunodeficiency is so profound that there is a serious concern. And
so
in some,
even with fungal prophylaxis, this is just a PRN basis? Because that's kind of how we are.
So it depends. I mean, again, if you have a history of chronic oral thrush, then one could consider putting you on a continuous fungal prophylaxis. If you have had a few episodes, it doesn't make much sense actually to put you on a because again, this most of the times actually use azoles, azoles and liver toxicity. So you don't want to expose individuals to liver toxicity again for unknown reasons.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Of course. Okay. Right. So one word about transplant and how do we do transplant in CID? So actually this slide was made by Sang-Yan Pai, is here for Lynn. Sang-Yan has been a colleague of mine for years in Boston. And so I'm grateful to her for this slide. So you basically have the baby. This is, let's say, a baby. And normally if this baby has a disease like unfortunately leukemia that requires a transplant. So the baby has his or her own T cells. You need, and has stem cells that you want to remove because you want to replace the wrong cells from the baby with the cells of a healthy donor. So to do that, typically you use chemotherapy because you want to ablate the stem cells and introduce the stem cell from the donor. You use immunosuppressive agents because otherwise the T cells from the baby would eventually reject the donor stem cells. So that is called conditioning to prepare the patient. And so the patient would receive the transplant and then hopefully if everything goes well, that cures the disease. If you have a SCID baby, things are different because in a SCID baby, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are no T cells around. So in theory, the baby is incapable of rejecting the transplant. And you don't really need to use chemotherapy because there is selective advantage for the donor cells to engraft in the baby and give T cells. Although you may not engraft enough of the stem cells, and so over time you may end up with this problem of waning of T cell immunity. But the dogma has been typically that because of the weakness of the immune system, you don't need chemotherapy, you don't need immunosuppression, the baby would be incapable of rejecting the transplant, and the transplant would work in the absence of chemotherapy. But CID is different. Because in CID, the T cells are there. They may not be as good, they may not be as many, but there is a chance actually that they would reject the graft. And you also need to prepare this baby because the wrong stem cells would compete with the donor-derived stem cells. And if you don't really engraft enough of these and remove these, you may actually not correct the disease. So typically for CID, some chemotherapy, some immunosuppression is needed at the time of transplant. That makes a big difference with SCID, typical SCID. All right, so there are many ways of giving chemotherapy. And again, things are becoming more and more complicated. This is just a cartoon that describes some of the protocols that are available. So you have chemotherapy may be looked at in terms of intensity of myeloablation. So how much you damage the marrow to remove the stem cells of the recipient so that the donor stem cells may engraft. This is the intensity of myeloablation. But the more myeloablation used, the more toxicity also expose the patient to because these grafts are toxic. And you also may use different degrees of immunosuppression, from no immunosuppression to heavy immunosuppression to prevent actually graft rejection. So use a combination of these, and so you go from no conditioning at all to fully myeloablative and highly immunosuppressive regimens, or a little less intensity regimens like this ones. So it may come in different flavors. There is no rule for any given disease. You also have to look at the condition of that patient, that specific patient. You need to look at the organ situation of that patient, the clinical history of that patient, what complications that patient did have, because the same regimen may be toxic for one individual and less toxic for another individual. So there is no rule written in stone here. So again, these are the factors that really affect the choice of what condition to use. Does the patient have active infections? If you have active infections, you have to be very careful with both myeloablation and immunosuppression. If the patient has serious organ dysfunction, then some drugs may not be used. If there is immune dysregulation, you may need to use more immunosuppression because that patient has an overactive immune system and you need to suppress the immune system. And finally, it depends really also on the biology of the disease. Some diseases actually do okay if you have a mixture of donor and autologous cells, recipient cells. Some diseases actually don't do that well in that situation, and you really need to replace completely the stem cells from the patient with the stem cells of the donor. So mixed chimeras versus full chimeras may give totally different results in different diseases from a clinical standpoint. So these are all factors to consider. What proportion of CID patients receive transplant? And again, the same study from Speckman in Germany, actually not a low proportion. Approximately 40% of the patients with CID in this study received transplant over the course of the study. So So that's not a low number. Obviously lower than the atypical SCID. So patients were, remember, the CID were divided into atypical SCID, real CID, unknown. So the unknown, doctors were still unclear. Well, is it appropriate to propose a transplant? We don't know what the gene defect is. And so they decided in many cases actually not to do the transplant, although a quarter of these patients actually did receive a transplant. Of course, you are less prone, less into transplanting a patient. You don't know exactly what the problem is. If you find a mutation associated with atypical SCID, well, the majority of these patients went to transplant. Because now the doctor said, well, I mean, this is a serious disease, so we need to treat it. But for CID also, approximately 50% of them did receive the transplant. Now, what is the result of transplant? Historically, patients with CID, these are studies, relatively recent, about 9 years ago, didn't do as well as a patient with SCID. So this is a study from Europe. Survival in all cases of CID was approximately 50%, which is clearly worse than SCID patients, especially those that received a matched sibling donor in SCID. Already in those years did very well, 90% survival. So way worse with CID. But things have changed. Things have changed over time.
I'm sorry, question.
Yeah.
What were the relative ages between those two groups? Do you know? Age of transplant.
Yes. So these patients go to transplant later. And that's actually mentioned here. So they were off. So one of the reasons why the outcome may be worse, well, there are many reasons, but one of the reasons is often that these are diagnosed late. And they're diagnosed late when there is already organ damage. And so if you wait too long, then unfortunately the outcome of transplant is also going to be less good. But now we are able, because of the improvements in advances in genetics, advances in immunological tests, we're able actually to diagnose CID earlier. And so let me give you one example of how things have evolved. This was a study that was published 2 years ago from Maite de la Morena on CD40 ligand deficiency, international study. Look at how things have changed. So this is the entire experience of bone marrow transplantation CD40 ligand deficiency, X-linked hypergene syndrome, which is one type of combined immunodeficiency. And this was comparing survival in patients that received transplant versus patients that didn't receive transplant. And you can tell, well, what's the point of transplanting these patients? Because overall, they don't do well, they don't do better than the patients that didn't receive transplant, right? That could be the conclusion. This is based on the total cohort of patients, 109 that did not receive transplant, 67 that had been transplanted. But this is over a long period of time. You see some patients here are 30 years since diagnosis. So how are things evolving? The same study looked at impact of year of diagnosis on survival after transplant. This is the survival of patients who received transplant and were diagnosed between 64 and 92. This is the survival of patients who were diagnosed between 93 and 2014. A major difference. Only 40% of these survived versus over 90%. This is already telling you that in this period of time, 30 years difference, or 20 years difference more or less, there has been a significant improvement in the outcome of transplantation. We recognize these patients earlier. We know how to treat their problems better. We can prevent many of these problems much better. So there is indeed a lot of hope. And also, transplanting these patients earlier, before they develop organ damage, makes a big difference. These are the patients that have been transplanted at age over or 5 or higher, and these are patients that have been transplanted younger than 5 years. Again, a significant difference in terms of survival. Sorry. This is so true that, in fact, a more recent study has just been published. This is actually just been published a couple of weeks ago. And again, it's an international study from Europe, from the United States, from Northern America and Canada also, looking at the outcome of transplantation and comparing actually the good and the bad about transplant. So if you're transplanted after year 2000, if you're transplanted at age less than 10 years, you don't have organ damage before transplantation, the outcome of transplantation is good. If you've been transplanted earlier than 2000, older than 10 years, or with organ damage, that actually has a negative impact on transplant and survival. Other factors, use of myeloablative regimens. In this case, that's a good thing. So you need really to have a good donor engraftment, good donor candidate. If you use reduced toxicity, reduced intensity regimens, then you don't do as well. That's not a good thing for this disease. If you have a matched sibling donor, much better. If you don't have a matched sibling donor, this has a negative impact on outcome. And if you put all of that together, these are the results according to age of year of transplantation. Before year 2000, in over 10 years of age. After year 2000, less than 5 years of age. You see now almost 90-95% of the patients, if they have been transplanted at a young age and in recent years, they do extremely well. Okay, that's the age and year transplantation. So you compare this, and this is the organ damage. In recent years, no organ damage. All of them have been cured. There has been no single death if you've gone to transplant recently with no organ damage. If you were transplanted many years ago with organ damage, 40% survival. So that tells you really that there is evolution, there is progress, there is a strong hope for these conditions, which until a few years ago were difficult to transplant and were often leading, unfortunately, to a less positive outcome than typical SCID or atypical SCID. And time for questions. Yeah.
Omenn syndrome,
Yes.
very rare, which of course is our blessing. How does that fit into a CID diagnosis?
Thank you. So Omenn syndrome now, especially Omenn syndrome in pediatric age, should absolutely prompt a genetic diagnosis. There is a study that's just been published, again by Alan Fisher. He looked at Omenn syndrome at his own center. Omenn syndrome in pediatric age, the majority of the patients were found to carry a gene defect. Hematologists, until a few years ago, they would treat Omenn syndrome, for those who don't know, is basically the association of 2 or more types of cytopenias. You can have autoimmune anemia, thrombocytopenia, or neutropenia. If you have at least 2 episodes, you're called Omenn syndrome. So until recently, the hematologists would treat the individual episode. If it relapsed, they would treat again. They would not necessarily proceed with genetic diagnosis. What Alan Fisher has shown, he only looked at patients with Omenn syndrome at his center, being completely ignorant about their immune status. He didn't look at the rest of the immune system. Just a diagnosis of Omenn syndrome at the end of the day. The majority of the patients carry gene defects. The majority of them have defects of the immune system. So it absolutely should prompt a molecular diagnosis.
CTLA-4?
Yeah, that's one of the most common.
That he has been diagnosed.
That's one of the most common. So Omenn syndrome absolutely is a situation that is very common in that disease. But having Omenn syndrome should immediately prompt genetic study, including CTLA-4.
Is it beneficial for parents to get genetic testing as well for son?
Yes.
Would
So
that
the
help?
problem with CTLA-4 is what Sergio actually was mentioning. So you may want to comment on it. So if the difficulty with CTLA-4 is that we do have incomplete, what we call incomplete penetrance. So you may carry the gene defect and have no symptoms. Right. So you may wonder, well, is it a good thing to know whether you carry gene defect? I think it is. It doesn't necessarily mean that you should be treated if you have the gene defect. If you have no symptoms, you should not be treated, but you should be followed. Because being asymptomatic now, even in adulthood, doesn't mean that you remain asymptomatic in your entire life. I mean, we do have actually individuals who start developing symptoms relatively late in life. Knowing that you have the condition at least will put you, with an alert, basically, that I need to be seen by my doctor on a regular basis. I need to do a CPC, every so often. Don't be too aggressive. Don't rush into any treatment if you don't have any symptoms. You only treat if you have symptoms. You don't treat if you don't have symptoms. But I think it's a good treatment.
But would it help with his diagnosis as well? I mean, could it tell them something that they're not aware of? Like, we have something different? Would it help with his diagnosis?
You mean testing CTLA-4 or testing in general?
Testing in general.
Well, it's always hope, so that's the other important point. I mean, the group from Baylor actually showed that many patients who think they have a single gene defect, they actually may have more than one. There's approximately 5%. 5% of the patients with PID have more than one gene defect. And when you
we have more than one, the clinical manifestations may be different. So yes, if there is something weird about the clinical history that doesn't really fit with what is known for instance, for CTLA-4, then it would be good to extend the genetic analysis and do all exome or do it, general PID panel.
Also, keep in mind that for CTLA-4 it's pretty tricky to diagnose it because it's haploinsufficiency. You have one completely normal and you might have just nothing on the other side. So you have to do specific tests in order to find that you have the full amount of gene, wild-type gene expressed. In your case, it looks to be already defined which the mutation is, so they're going to be the proper thing to do to test in your relatives that they want to be tested.
Thank you.